Justice denied in Sri Lanka. The UN says the government is failing to pursue crimes from the civil war. But Sri Lanka's leaders reject this. So, will the conflict's victims ever find out the truth about what happened? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. It's been 12 years since Sri Lanka's civil war ended. About 100,000 people died and more than 20,000 disappeared. Government troops and the Tamil separatists they were fighting were both accused of murder and torture, particularly towards the end of the conflict. Since then, the UN says little has been done to find out what happened. Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet says victims have been denied justice, and she's accused the government of further eroding human rights. Sri Lanka's leaders reject the accusations. We'll bring in our guests in a moment. First, this report by Bernard Smith.
Nearly 12 years after the end of Sri Lanka's civil war, the pain is still raw for those whose sons, daughters and husbands disappeared. This was a protest earlier this month. They want answers, accountability and justice. They're not getting any because the United Nations Human Rights Council says the highest levels of Sri Lanka's government is in denial about past crimes.
The space for civil society and independent media, which had grown significantly, is now rapidly shrinking. The independence of the judiciary, the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, the National Police Commission, and other key bodies has been deeply eroded by the recently adopted 20th Constitutional Amendment.
President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was Defence Secretary at the end of the Civil War. His brother, Mahinda, was President. 100,000 people were killed in the 26-year-long war between Tamil separatists and the government. Both sides are accused of crimes including murder and torture. And now the UN says minority groups are facing more discrimination. This protest in February was a rare combined march of Muslims and Tamils with a long list of complaints, including trying to get education in the Tamil language and oppressive police surveillance of Muslims. Sri Lanka's government rejects all the allegations made in the report, including claims it uses divisive rhetoric.
Sri Lanka's constitution guarantees, as I mentioned before, fundamental rights of all citizens. And anyone can canvass under the fundamental rights. And also, Sri Lanka, in the last few years as well as today, we have all our programs, economic, social or other beneficial programs, all are equally enjoyed and implemented from the north to the south.
Leela Nadaraja's son was taken away by the military at the end of the war. She's no idea what happened to him, but is convinced he's still alive. Her story is the same for thousands of other families.
What we see now is that they're trying to make us fed up and stop the protests, so we can't trust them. We will have to go to the international community to get our children back, as we have realised that there is no point going to the government here.
The UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights has urged member states to consider prosecuting alleged crimes in Sri Lanka to try and get answers for the thousands of people like Leela. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera.
As you heard there, the UN says the 20th Amendment to Sri Lanka's constitution has further eroded human rights. So, what's changed? Last October, Parliament overwhelmingly approved giving the president more power. Gotabaya Rajapaksa can remove any minister, including the Prime Minister, and he can dissolve Parliament a year after its election. The president has full immunity from prosecution, and he can appoint top judges, the police chief, and the heads of the electoral and human rights commissions. All right, let's bring in our guests from Colombo. Paikaisothi Saravanamuttu, a political analyst and chief executive of the Center for Policy Alternatives. In Beijing, Palita Kohona, Sri Lanka's ambassador to China. And in London, Darsha Jegatheswaran, a human rights lawyer. Thank you all for joining us. Palita, let me start with you today. UN Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet said on Wednesday that 12 years after the end of armed conflict in Sri Lanka, domestic efforts to ensure justice for the victims have failed. What is your response to that?
I have a number of comments on that. First and foremost, I think what Michelle Bachelet, a very senior UN official and a former president of Chile, has misunderstood her role. I do not think, as a former UN employee also and a senior official at the UN, that it's a job of the High Commissioner to tar and feather countries. Her job is to assist countries, all countries, not only Sri Lanka, to improve their human rights performance. Her job is to make the world a better place, not to go around identifying countries and finding fault with them and making suggestions to penalize them. And also what is most important is that she bases herself on reports which have been debunked over and over again. And also she bases herself on allegations, innuendo, and suggestion, which I think is not her role. Her role is to help countries, assist countries to improve their performance, and not only Sri Lanka, but also other countries. And there are many countries around us, including in the West, which need their human rights performance improved. So I have a lot of problems with what she has said.
Darsha, High Commissioner Bachelet also accused Sri Lanka of reneging on promises to ensure justice for thousands of civilians killed in the final stages of the 37-year separatist war that ended in 2009. Do you agree with that assessment?
I completely agree. I mean, I think over the past few years, we've seen a really worrying trajectory in Sri Lanka, which I think Michelle Bachelet has pointed to, signaling, and as she has said, that there is a real recurrence and risk of violence and cycles of violence. And I think this points to the fact that Sri Lanka has still failed to address the root causes of its ethnic conflict. And over the last few years, there's been a real ramping up of militarization, an increase in attacks on human rights defenders, journalists, and victim survivor communities. You know, this past Saturday marked 4 years since Tamil families of the disappeared across the Northeast began protesting, looking for answers and justice around their loved ones who had been disappeared. Many of whom had been disappeared during that final phase of the armed conflict. And I think, again, kind of symbolizes the fact that Sri Lanka is a country that has sort of allowed for and encouraged impunity rather than actually dealing with issues in its past and kind of pushing for accountability so that we don't see a recurrence of violence.
Paikya Sothi, how concerned are you about what's going on currently in Sri Lanka? I mean, do you believe that the country is at a tipping point of sorts?
Oh, yes, very definitely. I think that the great danger in Sri Lanka at the present moment is the consolidation of this culture of impunity and increased militarization as far as government and governance is concerned. If nothing's done about it, we are going to be in a pretty bad shape indeed. You know, we have a culture of impunity which has been elevated now almost to the system of governance as far as accountability for these allegations are concerned. I mean, I think what needs to be understood at the end of the day is that we are members of an international community, and being members of an international community means that we have certain obligations and certain responsibilities. We can't cherry pick those that which we are going to fulfill or not, you know. So we are definitely at a tipping point.
Palitha, several countries, including the UK, Canada, Germany, they have submitted a draft resolution for consideration by the UNHRC. It expresses concern over what it calls warning signs of a deteriorating human rights situation in Sri Lanka. What do you say to that?
I don't think the High Commissioner is well informed. If anybody were to go to Colombo today, I do not know where they will find this deteriorating situation. The communities are very well integrated, intermixed. The vast majority of the Tamil population, whom I assume we are talking about, lives not in the so-called homelands, but amongst the Sinhalese in the south. 54% of them, in fact. And if the situation was deteriorating, they would be fleeing in droves to the north and the east. They're not. The exact opposite is true. They're coming in their thousands to live in the south because that's where their job opportunities are, and also because the rest of the community welcomes them. I don't think there is a tipping point. In fact, it's a myth that is being propagated by self-serving political entities. I don't think we have reached a tipping point, and it's very unlikely that we will, because the tipping point was there in 2006 to 2008 when the LTTE ruled the North and the East, and they were carrying on a massive campaign of terrorism when children were being recruited for combat purposes, where civilians were being bombed at random. It's not happening anymore. Where is this tipping point? I don't think there is a tipping point. And also this question about thousands of civilians being killed. Has anybody done a count? Where is this count? Where are the graves of these civilians who apparently died or were killed during the last stages of the conflict? Nobody's ever found them. Nobody's found the bones. Where are they?
Paikya Sothi, let me ask you about this draft resolution that's been submitted to the UNHRC. I mean, do you believe that ultimately it will pass? And if so, what happens next?
Well, I think there is a reasonable chance of it passing. What happens next is, I think, entirely up to the member states. As we all know, the Human Rights Council, whatever it does, it can only make recommendations. It can't mandate states to X and Y, and therefore it is up to the states to decide. The High Commissioner has talked about individual sanctions, travel sanctions, freezing of assets. She has urged countries to consider universal jurisdiction and going to the International Criminal Court. Now, the last one, of course, is highly unlikely in the short term because of the Russian and Chinese veto, and it has to go through the Security Council because Sri Lanka did not sign the Rome Statute. But nevertheless, I think there are steps that can be taken by individual countries in fulfillment of this resolution and the recommendations. And indeed, I mean, the pressure, I think, needs to be kept on the government of Sri Lanka to meaningfully engage in reconciliation. In 2009, we went into a post-war phase. We're still in that post-war phase. We're not in a post-conflict phase where the roots of conflict are not reproduced and certainly not sustained.
Darsha, based on your observations, is there a chance that we could see a reoccurrence of violence in Sri Lanka? I mean, are you worried about that being a possibility going forward?
Definitely. And I think kind of tied into the resolution and sort of the sentiments of communities on the island, recently we saw this humongous march that was jointly between the Tamil and Muslim communities of the Northeast, from an eastern point on the island to a northern point on the island, P2P. And it attracted, some estimates put it at about 50,000 individuals. It kind of talked about the number of issues that these communities are still facing, ranging from forced cremations to increased militarizations to a lack of accountability for these really heinous atrocity crimes that occurred during the end of the war and despite the government's assertions are incredibly well documented both by UN entities as well as international organizations. And so I think there is like a real kind of concern that if there aren't any checks and balances put in place, and if this kind of continues, the sort of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism that in a way underpins this government continues unchecked, that we are going to see kind of a real risk of recurrence of violence. And I think Myanmar, for example, and the recent coup there is an important lesson in how unchecked military power can lead to real problematic breakdowns in the rule of law.
Palitha, last year, Sri Lanka pulled out of a 2015 UN resolution calling for accountability for alleged excesses carried out by Sri Lankan troops and reparations for victims. What was the justification for doing so?
Two important justifications. One is that some of the commitments made under that resolution were not consistent with the Constitution of Sri Lanka. In fact, there have been suggestions made that those who committed Sri Lanka under that resolution by co-sponsoring it should be hauled up before the courts for acting contrary to the constitution. Secondly, there was a massive sentiment in the country against that resolution. And in a democracy, any government will have to respond to public pressure. The current government was elected with a 2/3 majority. And one of the key planks on which it went to the public, to the electorate, was the resolution of 2015, 30/1. And the electorate expressed itself in no uncertain terms about what it felt. And there we are. We have got two very good reasons for withdrawing from that co-sponsorship. As you know very well, around the world, in democracies, countries have not complied or gone ahead with their commitments to comply with international obligations when confronted by domestic opposition. The United States is a classic example for that. So in the circumstances, there was no option for the government but to withdraw its signature. And then, of course, having said that, has the government not done taken adequate measures to comply with whatever it voluntarily agreed to do? It has. And there are other things that it continues to do. For example, tracing of missing persons. It's not complete. And I don't think anywhere in the world you could trace all the missing persons in a conflict in a space of 10 years. There are people still missing after the Second World War or the Vietnam War. They have not all been traced. So why should little Sri Lanka, a developing country with limited resources, be pushed to the wall and told to account for everybody that went missing? In fact, in the case of some missing persons, they have been discovered living happily in certain Western countries. In fact, recently, an individual was tried before a court of law in Germany, and he was listed as missing. So I think this is all, there's a lot of propaganda involved, a lot of pressure exerted by entities who have a stake in this. And for them, this has become a game now. Who's going to win at the end of the day? Who can put more pressure on not the international community? It's only certain Western countries who respond to this type of pressure. The question is,
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just that we're starting to run out of time. So I just want to. It looked to me as though Darsha may have wanted to jump in and respond to some of what you were saying. Darsha, please go ahead.
I mean, I think it's sort of ridiculous to kind of dismiss the calls of families of the disappeared across the island who have loved ones who were taken and disappeared by perpetrators that were primarily the Sri Lankan state. This kind of allegation that these individuals are in the diaspora and, simply recorded as missing doesn't line up with the facts. Sri Lanka continues to remain the country that has the second highest number of complaints filed with the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. A lot of the women who are protesting on the roads right now spent years after the war ended going from military camp to police station in groups to protect themselves from being potentially disappeared and possibly sexually assaulted, looking for their disappeared children, their husbands, their wives. And, to the question of where these individuals are, well, if the government is so confident that this issue is one that they're not afraid of handling, then why try so hard to suppress the voices of the families of the disappeared? A mother that I spoke to last week said that she was being visited multiple times a day by intelligence officers, and that's true of women who lead these protests across the north and east. Their police are taking out court orders to prevent them from protesting, while the military continues to have parades in the south, and we're told that these so-called court orders are because of COVID. So I think it's just such a shame that the Sri Lankan government fails to recognize the pain and suffering. An enforced disappearance takes such a psychological toll on the family members of the victim, and to not address these issues, and the fact that the government and its representatives still today are denying the very fact of those disappearances and the importance of addressing them is to me the perfect example of the Sri Lankan government's attitude towards its subnational populations, whether that be the Tamil community or the Muslim community, and again reiterates the need for international intervention.
Paikya Sothi, I want to ask you about this 20th constitutional amendment. There are many groups that have expressed concern that the independence of the judiciary in Sri Lanka, as well as other bodies such as the Human Rights Commission, that they have been significantly weakened by this constitutional amendment. What have the ramifications of this amendment been throughout the country?
Well, effectively, what the amendment has done is to remove any checks or balances on the exercise of executive authority and power by the elected president. We had a constitutional council. It was by no means perfect, but at least it vetted, if you like, the various appointments to state institutions, as well as judges, etc. Now, of course, the president will appoint, and there is a parliamentary council which will just give their observations as to who he chooses. And getting their observations in itself is not mandatory either. So what we have here is the consolidation and centralization of power in the office of one person, which is, has terrible repercussions for democracy, for the whole question of the institutions and processes of democracy in our country.
Palitha, let me throw that question to you as well. I mean, what do you say to critics of this 20th constitutional amendment?
First and foremost, the 19th Amendment, which the 20th sought to replace, was not the most popular amendment in the country. This was very clear, abundantly clear, in the way the electorate voted at the presidential election and the parliamentary election. A government that has had the mandate to make these changes obviously has to respond to that mandate, deliver on that mandate. And I don't think it is now appropriate or even permissible to say, oh, the government did the wrong thing. The government went to the electorate with certain promises and it has delivered on them. And then one more point I need to raise. The ridiculousness is not about the government denying or denying the existence of disappearees. The ridiculousness is about keeping on making this allegation over and over again, ad infinitum, without any substantiation. You could stir up the population. You could stir up certain segments of the population to march up and down the streets. It's not a difficult thing in a modern democracy. With modern communication facilities, you can do that. And it's being done over and over again in Sri Lanka. And so let me finish on this point. To say that mothers are crying, of course I cry for those mothers who've lost their loved ones, for the sisters who have lost their brothers, for the fathers who have lost their sons and daughters. Yes, I cry for them too. But to keep on making this allegation without any substantiated, any concrete substantiation, I think it reeks of propaganda and political grandstanding.
Darsha, we just have less than a minute left. I just want to ask you very quickly about the chilling effect all of this has had on civil society in Sri Lanka.
No, I mean, I think it has had an enormous chilling effect on civil society. In fact, the Secretariat of NGOs has now been brought under the Ministry of Defense, which is headed by Kamal Gunaratne, who is himself named in several UN reports as having alleged to have been committed war crimes. And so a number of civil society organizations across the North and East and across the island, in fact, have really self-censored to make sure that they can survive this regime. And that includes kind of families of the disappeared who, despite the government's real efforts to silence their claims, continue to protest on the roads because what they really want is to be reunited with their loved ones, or at least know what happened to them.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Paikya Sothi, Saravanamutu, Palitha Kohona, and Darsha Jegatheswaran. And thank you, too, for watching. You can watch this and our previous programs anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.